looking back, looking forward, looking down, looking up, looking around. Come, join a journey of exploration to the distant past, to the frontiers of tomorrow. From the infinitely small to the infinitely large, the mysterious, the mundane. Come, let us travel to the horizons of knowledge. This program has been made possible thanks to a generous grant from the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, the Vodafone Egypt Foundation, the OPEC Fund for International Development, and the Carnegie Corporation of New York. The moon, beauty and fascination, romance and friendly, gentle light amidst the darkness. Humans have long been enthralled by the moon. Moon gods and goddesses peopled the most ancient polytheistic religions. In more recent times, even before formal machine-powered flight was a reality, some were dreaming of traveling to the moon. What an adventure that would be. And yet, in an amazingly short time, 66 years from the first flight of the Wright brothers in 1903 to the 20th of July 1969, when Neil Armstrong actually walked on the moon. It was to be, in his immortal words, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. It was one of the greatest accomplishments of humanity. And this is the story of that voyage to the moon. A voyage to the moon. Over 40 years ago, we humans achieved that amazing feat. How we succeeded in getting out there despite enormous odds is our story today. From the most ancient times, people looked to the moon as a friendly light in the darkness of night, an inspiration for poetry and romance. And on a more utilitarian level, the lunar cycle helped the ancients determine the rhythm of the month, and they gradually uncovered its impact on the tides. Long before machine-powered flight became a reality, scientists looked at its markings and tried to decipher them. I am in the company of the great Ibn al-Haytham in the 10th century. He is writing about the traces on the face of the moon. He concludes that they are seas and mountains, implicitly a world not all that different from our own. The desire to travel to the moon has been a recurrent theme for many writers. From the science fiction greats like Jules Verne, countless others have written about space travel and visits to the moon. It has also been a staple of movies from the earliest times to the creation of great classics like 2001 and Total Recall. Scientists had figured that rockets, not airplanes, would actually be the vehicles to take us to the moon. Unlike airplanes, rockets are intended to take off vertically and attain great speeds to reach an objective. A pioneer of that was Robert Goddard.
كان كل الفكر زمان قبل ده إن مفيش حاجة هتطير إلا إذا تطلع كده. أول واحد يفكر قال أنا عايز أطلع حاجة كده. ويطلع إزاي كده؟ وهجيب لها إزاي قوة الدفع اللي هتطلعها كده وكذا. فهو اللي بدأ التجارب دي ونجحت.
Indeed, the flight of Goddard's rocket on March 16, 1926 at Auburn, Massachusetts was a feat as epochal in history as that of the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk. Yet it was only one of Goddard's firsts in the now booming significance of rocket propulsion in the field of military missilery and the scientific exploration of space. Robert Goddard's basic contributions to rockets and spaceflight make a very lengthy list. He first explored mathematically the practicality of using rocket propulsion to reach high altitudes and even the moon. And that was as early as 1912. He was the first to prove by actual static test that a rocket will work in a vacuum. In other words, it does not need to push against air in order to move forward. He was the first to develop and shoot a liquid fuel rocket on March 16, 1926. He is the first who sent something, a payload, a barometer and a camera in that case, in a rocket flight in 1929. He was the first to use vanes in the rocket motor blast for guidance in 1932. And he was the first to develop gyro control apparatus for rocket flight. He's the first ever to receive a US patent in the idea of the multi-stage rocket, and that was as early as 1914. He was the first to develop pumps that were suitable for rocket fuels. And he was the first to successfully launch a rocket with a motor pivoted on gimbals under the influence of a gyro mechanism in 1937. An amazing contribution. But there were also some other distinguished scientists. Other rocket pioneers included the German rocket scientist Hermann Oberth. Around me are some of the great milestones of rocketry beyond the early models of Goddard. We have examples of the German V1 and V2 rockets of the Second World War, the great rockets that were used for space exploration, and even the cruise missile rockets of the United States. But one German scientist, Werner von Braun, born in 1912 and he died in 1977, would have a decisive role to play in the saga that takes us to the moon. The Saturn V would be the workhorse for the Apollo flights that would take humans to the moon. The Cold War gains momentum. And suddenly, in late 1957, early 1958, the world was surprised by a series of amazing feats. The first of these, the Soviet Union has succeeded in placing the first man-made object into orbit. The Earth has a satellite made by humans, Sputnik, about the size of a basketball, armed only with primitive technology, nevertheless sent an awesome message back to Earth. The age of space exploration has begun.
دي قلبت الدنيا. ليه؟ لأن الأمريكان شعروا إن ده إزاي الروس يروحوا قبلنا، لازم نعمل هيئة مدنية ونفتحها لكل الناس اللي في الجامعات والمدنيين عشان هم دول اللي هيرفعوا من العلم من مستوى العلم والتكنولوجيا. فدي كانت خطوة خطيرة.
The Americans had to respond to the challenge of Sputnik.
I promised the Secretary of the Army that we would be ready in 90 days or less. Let's go, Werner.
3, 2, 1.
By that time, the Russians were still ahead. In fact, the Russian Yuri Gagarin was the first human being to actually orbit the Earth. The space race had begun in earnest, and it was the young President Kennedy who would give the program the enormous inspiration that it needed.
لما كينيدي اتكلم بطلاقة وبوسيلة هايلة جدا، خد معاه كل الأمريكان.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
Now, Kennedy had redefined the goal of the race.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
It was not necessarily a scientific goal, but a political one, and one which would inspire everybody. The whole world could relate to it. It was a challenge in the name of all of humanity. The newly established NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Agency of the United States, started working in earnest. Basically, astronauts would go up in capsules carried by rockets. First, in the so-called Mercury program, the capsules would carry one person. It would take them up and down, and then in orbiting the Earth. The second program would be Gemini. There would be 2 astronauts, and they would orbit the Earth and step out of the capsule and back in again. And then the third step would be Apollo. And Apollo would carry 3 astronauts, and it would be the one that would go all the way to the moon. Within each of those programs, there were multiple shots. And in fact, it would be Apollo 11 that would reach the moon. Here, with the Mercury project, John Glenn was the first American to fly in space.
Roger, 0G, and I feel fine. Capsule is turning around.
Following up on the success of Mercury came Gemini. 2 astronauts flying together in this capsule, and for the first time, an astronaut stepping outside of the capsule for what we now call a spacewalk. An endurance flight for a full 14 days was undertaken in this tiny, cramped little capsule. The project of sending a rocket to the moon was not going to be an easy one. Just to break free of the gravity pull of Earth, a giant multi-stage rocket was required. And as every stage of that rocket was used, it would drop off and a smaller piece of it would continue. By the end of the 3 stages, the payload, the most important part
of the rocket would continue, and then it would be pulled into the orbit of the moon. Orbiting the moon many times over, it would detach in two pieces. The command module would remain orbiting the moon while the lunar lander would go down to the surface carrying two astronauts. Upon landing on the moon, the astronauts would undertake the missions required on the surface of the moon in their spacesuits, would then get back in and leave a large part of the lander on the surface of the moon and take only the small pod, which would reconnect with the command module orbiting the moon. They would transfer from their small pod into the Apollo capsule, and that would travel with them back to Earth and detach, and only this cone would be held by parachutes as it landed into the water, having been protected by a heat shield in its re-entry through the atmosphere of the Earth. The space program would have its fallen heroes, those who would lay down their lives in the name of exploration. And in a fiery explosion, now referred to as Apollo 1, 3 astronauts would die. The Apollo 11 mission, with Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins, landed on the moon on the 20th of July, 1969.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
And it was for mankind, or humankind, I guess we have to say today. But and everyone felt it and felt part of it. And it was a human being that had done that. And so I believe that that's where the inspiration comes to us to do these great things and will in the future also.
Apollo 11 returned to Earth at 12:50 in the mid-Pacific, where the astronauts were carried by helicopter to the recovery ship, the USS Hornet. It was a moment of great delirium.
Perhaps the most interesting souvenir from the visit to the moon is the actual rocks that were brought back from the moon. And here in the Smithsonian, there is this little triangular piece which is available on exhibit and that people can actually touch.
The Apollo 17 mission, launched in December 1972, was the final lunar landing mission of the Apollo program. It remains the last visit of humans to the moon. Eugene Cernan, Ronald Evans, and Harrison Schmitt made 75 orbits of the moon, spent over 22 hours on its surface, and brought back over 240 pounds of samples from the moon. But since that time, no humans have set foot on the moon. Today, space research continues, and the Space Shuttle is the vehicle that provides data for that research.
1, 0, and liftoff of Space Shuttle Atlantis. Mission to build, resupply.
Here I am in front of one of the most important vehicles ever. This is, of course, the Space Shuttle, the first vehicle that was able to go into space, undertake missions, even bring back material if needed, all the way back to Earth.
And although tragedies may occur, like the unfortunate Challenger voyage,
we have main engine start, 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of Earth to touch the face of God.
The Space Shuttle would be the main workhorse of the space program for 30 years. It put the Hubble Space Telescope in space, fixed its defects, and did many other things before its retirement in 2011.
the quest for knowledge about the universe will and must continue. Today, there is increasing international collaboration in space, and we shall see the value of space exploration as relevant to our lives. Indeed, our future depends on space exploration in ways that we would have never thought possible. In our study of space, we address local problems and find solutions that may not otherwise be possible. As when we see from the heavens our Earth and map its resources with techniques that would not have been possible from its surface. Our collaboration across all nations for the benefit of humanity is leading us ever into new adventures in space. As the new century progresses, new opportunities are opening up. There are exciting new vistas of the next round of space exploration, driven not by the competition of the Cold War,
but by the collaboration of all of humanity. The International Space Station is the first fruit of such joint efforts. The question now is when and how will we return to the moon? When and how will we land on Mars? And when and how will we venture beyond that? All of this makes for a very exciting story. But that is a story for another day. I am Ismail Serageldin, thanking you for having joined me in this episode of Horizons.